So in this lesson, we're going to take a bit of a breakdown on the cover image and see how that was built. I'm going to go to File, Open, go to jump to my project root, Nuke, and then we're going to jump in Chapter 17, Exterior, Finished. So we'll take a look at the Nuke script, but first I just want to talk about the 3D side of things. So if we zoom in here, we have our look development scene, and then we have our final cover art for the exterior scene. We'll take a look at the underwater version of this in the next lesson, but let's take a look at how this was built in this lesson. So these are all the rocks that were used for the scene. These were scans that were done. So essentially how the cover image is made up is just by using these rocks, and then they were essentially duplicate and instanced around to make out this cave environment. And we can take a look at the look development scene now. So if I jump over to Maya, we got the look development scene here. If we take a closer look at one of these, you'll notice that they kind of look pretty faceted. That's because they're actually all proxied out. So they're using V-Ray proxies using the create V-Ray and create import proxy. So they were very high resolution at one point in time, and then they were baked out to disk using the VR mesh, and then they were brought back in using this VR mesh. And what we see in the viewport is the low res version, and at render time we get the high res version. So as you can see, there's a lot more detail than what the actual viewport is showing us. So we have our rocks, and then we have all our ground plane assets. And if you notice over here, we have this large one, and this is a bit out of context right now. This is actually the ground plane. It was all generated in Houdini, which we'll talk about as well. Now we can actually take a look at the actual 3D scene that was rendered. So here are all the rocks that have been instanced around. If we take a look at this, you can see that we have our 3D scene here. This is our hero light shaft, so this is the light shaft that you see right here. And then the foreground light shaft that we see right here is actually coming through here, right there. So these all started out as those initial look development scene rocks, and then they were all just kind of duplicated around to get the full environment. And then you can see our sand system that we were talking about earlier. We'll continue to talk about this. We'll actually jump into Houdini and take a look at how this was made. You can see they're actually set up to actually feel like they've actually been clumping along these rocks here. And then we can take a look at our lighting. So the lighting is pretty straightforward. We just have this dome light here with a sky HDRI. And then we have our directional light here. This directional light is actually turned off, as you'll see here. Sets the emit, diffuse, emit, specular, and intensity is all set to 0 to make sure that there's no ray tracing coming from this light. And then if we look at this light, we'll notice that we have a V-Ray sphere light parented to it. And if we move that around just like that, you'll see they're actually just using this directional light as a position for our sphere light. So this is as actually what's being rendered, and this is set to be non-renderable. And then we have an area light here that's set to push a little bit more lighting here to kind of cast some fill illumination in there. And then we have another light back here just to illuminate this rock back here. You can see that this rock is actually right back there. And then you notice we just have this little cage here that kind of prevents light from coming in from certain areas, just to make sure that there's no pools of light coming back through here. So then we can just take a look at our render layer setup. So I'll jump over to my render layers. You'll notice I have 3 different render layers, one for my beauty pass, one for my volumetrics, and one for my foreground volumetrics. If we check out the beauty pass, and if we jump into the render elements, you'll notice that we're using the same exact setup that we have been using. So it's just using that hybrid preset and the advanced render elements, advanced utility render elements preset. And then if you notice that we have our lighting passes, lighting render selects, Those are all to separate out our individual lights. And then we can just go ahead and give this a render to see what this looks like. If I go into my render cam, I'm just going to fire up IPR. You can see that we're getting our base render here. I'm just going to pause this. We'll take a look at this, what this looks like in Nuke. That would be this render right here. So if I just make sure my LUT is turned on, turn off sRGB, that is what that final render ended up looking like for the BD pass. And then we can check out our volumetrics layer. So if I hit volumetrics, I'll just fire up IPR again to see what we get. And there we go. You'll see that we're getting this kind of weird red, green, and blue lighting pass. That's because we're actually separating out our lights into individual RGB channels. So there's no light select for volumetrics. You can only separate out certain render elements like diffuse, raw, and specular. There's no way to actually separate out the volumetrics by themselves. So the trick for that is to essentially render them out as an RGB pass. So essentially the same thing as our multi-mats. So if we check out what these lights are actually illuminating, we'll go to this area light here, and we'll notice that we're just render layer overriding this to be green, and then we have blue back here, and then if we jump into our sound, we'll notice we have the red. So we have our red, we have our green, and then we have our blue right there. Then we can check out what our foreground volumetrics layer looks like. Fire up IPR. And there we go. So all the main volumetrics were separated out into one render layer, and then just the foreground were put on this render layer. And we can take a look at what that looks like in Nuke as well. So that's our foreground volumetric layer. This is our hero volumetric layer, so we got our red, green, and blue channels, just like that. And then we got our beauty pass, just like that. And our beauty pass has all the render elements that we've been working with all baked into them. So now we can jump into Houdini and see how the actual sand system was generated. So this is the end result, and it kind of looks a little bit strange, but if you see it in context with everything, you can see it actually looks pretty natural. So it actually feels like maybe there was some wind coming, and there was some actual clumping that was actually happening along these rocks. We got some wavy bits here and there. So this was actually used with Houdini's Ocean Toolkit. So if we check out what this looks like without the rocks interacting with the scene, you can see it just kind of looks like an ocean waved. And that's essentially used for the base ground plane. And you can see that we have our rocks here. And I'm essentially just using kind of like a color pass to manipulate this scene. So essentially doing a attribute transfer over onto this geometry. And then I'm using these values to lift those areas, just like that. And then I'm kind of doing the reverse to kind of make it feel like it's clumping there. So this is before and this is after that clumping system. And again, a lot of this might not make sense. I'm not expecting you. I'm just kind of giving you guys a little breakdown here to see how this was actually made. So now we can jump back over to Nuke, and we can kind of take a breakdown of how all this was put together. So here is the before and after. So before, after right there. And I'll switch this back over to sRGB to get the final look of this. So at the very top, you'll see that we have a couple different shuffles going on. So this is pretty common at the top of my Nuke scripts. Typically what I have is all my renders that are needed for that individual tree, they'll just be put in, shuffled together at the top. So right now we just have our volumetrics being shuffled into a volumetrics layer, and then our volumetrics foreground being shuffled into that channel. So if we look here, we have our volumetrics and then our volumetrics foreground. You'll see that we have a median filter here. So that's essentially just to help out with some fireflies that we're getting back here. If we enable that, you'll see them a little bit better. So the next thing that we have is this exterior map. So down the tree somewhere we needed to have a map for this exterior part, and we didn't actually get that from 3D. So essentially what we did is we just created that using the point position camera pass. So we're essentially just making a map based out of the depth information. You can see that, and then we're clamping that, and then we're throwing in another medium filter to get rid of these fireflies that we're seeing here. Just like that. And then I'm just shuffling this into the red channel. So it works just like a RGB map. Shuffling that into another channel called RGB mat underscore exterior. So RGB mat underscore exterior right there. And then we have the start of our beauty rebuild. So we have our unpremultiplication. It doesn't really matter in this case because we really don't have an alpha that we're working with. So we have our diffuse, and then we're creating our raw lighting right there. You'll notice we have some denoises that are happening here. So if you check out like this area right here, we're running a slight denoise on that just to clean up that grain a little bit. And then I'm just using a little rotospline just to kind of mat out the areas that need it. And then over here we have our GI. You'll see that GI turned out pretty grainy as well. So what I'm doing is just kind of denoising that as well, along with the ambient occlusion to clean that up a bit. We're using the ambient occlusion, just kind of darken this a little bit, like that. Then we're adding those together. Next up we have our diffuse. The only tweak that we're really making here is this area right here. So to kind of make this sand feel a bit softer, what we're doing is we're taking that facing ratio pass, we're masking it out just on the sand. So we're taking an RGB mat, RGB mat A, which looks something like this. So we have our rocks and our sand, and we're just taking the green channel of that, and we're using that to grade this facing ratio pass, just like that. And then we're using that to kind of lift and flatten out those areas to kind of make them feel a lot softer. And then we're adding some grain to the sand, so you can see that the 3D render kind of turned out a bit flat. There's not a lot of detail. The filtering really kills that high frequency texture detail. So what we're doing is we're taking this noise pattern, you see right there, and then we're mapping it on using the UV coordinates, just like this. And then we're essentially using that same mask that we're using up there for the sand to mat this out and just kind of multiply that on a little bit so you can kind of see a before and after. And then that just gets multiplied over our lighting pass, so just like that. And you can see we're adding on our specular and reflection information that just gets added on. There wasn't much tweaks done to that. We're doing a little exposure to the background. So this area back here, just kind of make it feel like it's more outside right now. Everything's kind of like melted together. That just kind of like lifts that exposure using that background mat that we created up the chain right there. Next up we have some volumetrics. So these guys right there. So I'm just shuffling out that volumetrics pass and I'm just using the red channel. And then I'm putting some grades on it like this. And then I'm just giving it a little bit of texture detail like that. And that's just being used, being created by this noise pattern that we see here. So it's just a noise, and then it's stretched. Then we're transforming it and grading it a little bit. And then we're multiplying that on just like that. And then we're just adding that on to our image just like that. Next up we have another layer of volumetrics. So we're grabbing that volumetrics layer again and grabbing the green channel. We're grading it a little bit, just like that, and then we're using that background mat to kind of darken this down a little bit. You'll notice that the background turns out a little too hot, like that. So we're just darkening that a little bit. to not kind of make that so overpowering back there. And you can see we're getting quite a bit of grain here, so I'm just running that through to grain to kind of soften that up a bit so we don't see all that grain coming through. We have another layer of volumetrics here, so our foreground volumetrics, and we're doing a similar kind of setup, just adding some hue into there. And I've got another texture here that we're doing some detail to, just like that. Running that through a denoise. I'm also blurring a little bit to soften it up. And then we're just adding that on as well, just like that. And then we're baking in our lookup table, so we can switch over to sRGB and work that way. So if I come down here and then just turn off IP for our viewer input, then switch over to sRGB, we can continue working in sRGB. So next up we have some atmosphere. So before and after the atmosphere, you can see we're kind of like lifting it as it goes back, which kind of helps with the scale. So for there, I'm just shuffling out that point position camera pass and creating this using the grade node. So based on depth information, just like right there. We're throwing a medium filter on here to get rid of these fireflies that we're seeing here, just like that. Gradient to kind of push that back a little bit. And you can kind of see without this part, our shadow areas kind of get a little too lifted. And if we just use the AO pass to kind of knock that back a bit, it helps out with the shadow areas. Just like that. Next up we have some light wrapping. So this is before, after. So you can see we're kind of creating this bloom that's happening here. So how I'm doing that is I am shuffling out that RGB matte exterior, multiplying it against our beauty pass that we already have here, and then I'm just blurring it out like that. I'm doing a little bit of grade, and then what I'm doing is taking the inverse of that matte and screening that on. So you can see if we don't have that matte, we're kind of screening over everything, but if we do have that matte, we're just getting this outside area just like that, which creates our light wrap. Next up, we're creating another light wrap, but instead of making this really, really broad, what we're going to do is just make it really, really tight. So you can see before and after there, how we're just creating that bloom right along the edge right there. So that's using the same technique, just that foreground matte, multiplied against beauty, blur that out, a little bit of a grade, and then just using that mask to mask that out as well. Now you can see, since we did a lot of compositing work along this edge here, we're kind of getting this little kind of like aliasing halo effect. And what I did to clean that up was just to use an edge blur. So I shuffled out the RGB matte exterior into the alpha, and then use that to blur our edge right there. Just kind of makes it a little bit more seamless. And next up, we have our color grade. So before and after our color grade. So you can see overall it kind of feels a bit greenish. There's not a lot of blues that are happening here, and that's exactly what this color grade is doing. It's just kind of making it a little more blue in the dark area, so it doesn't feel so green. And lastly, we have our crop and our lens distortion. So this is just cropping it, just like that, just for composition, and then we're just adding a little bit of lens distortion on there, just to kind of give it some distortion. And then final is just our film grain right there, just a subtle film grain over everything. And the last thing that you usually see a lot in my Nuke scripts is this little mirror node at the bottom. This is really, really handy for when you're doing bigger comps like this. You can kind of just come in here and toggle back and forth and kind of get a new perspective on this. A lot of times it's hard to see mistakes looking at the render the same way over and over. So when you flip it, you kind of get a better idea of what's happening. And then that's the final. Something else I want to talk about is this sand system actually kind of came later in the process. For a long time, the render looked like this. It just had rocks scattered at the bottom, and after a bit, it kind of felt like it was kind of missing something. It was kind of needed something, and sand was a good compromise to put in there. So something that's really cool about Nuke and its multi-channel workflow is the fact that updating this kind of stuff is really, really easy, even though you make drastic changes like this in 3D. So if I actually come up all the way up here to our renders, and if we come back to our cover image 1, you'll notice that we have no sand here, and then we have our sand added in cover image 2, just like that. And if I come all the way to the bottom and just view this, what we can do is if we're rendering with _V here, I can just do a version up and version down. So if I do Alt and then go down on my arrow key, I can go back down to version 1. And we'll let that render through. So you can see this is what it was looking like before. Then if I Alt up again, go back up to version 2, you can see we have a before and after. So Nuke makes that really, really easy to kind of get these updates, and it's a very procedural kind of system. So that is the exterior scene. In the next lesson, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the underwater version of this scene.